Types of programs you can do without having too much money. Yeah, okay. I want to act in any films you are making, okay? See, I make a good actor.
And what we're going to be doing now is peer education, because this is a very important component of the harm reduction approaches that have been used very successfully around the world. As Jimmy mentioned yesterday in the outreach one, outreach is that ability to go out of this room, out of an office, and reach out to drug users. As you would know, many go into hiding. They are not always difficult to access, and outreach is the most successful approach in terms of accessing drug users and then making a very serious attempt of controlling the HIV epidemic. Without outreach, it would be a major, major problem, because many drug users, as you know, feel very reluctant to come into services, and many of them are very scared until, of course, they build up a relationship, a trustful relationship. If they trust you, then you will see them come in. But that takes a little bit of time, because as you know, drug use is a criminal offence. And if it is a crime, there is a potential for you to end up in prison, or to be beaten up by the local community, or beaten up by the police. So you can understand from a drug user point of view, how is it that we're still going to receive some information without some form of punishment? So that is outreach. Crucially, the most important way of reaching out to drug users. But then, of course, we have to think of peer education. In many ways, as we will describe, people learn from other people. We often learn from our colleagues. So if we are going into a medical school, we are learning from other medical students because they are our peers. In this example here is a situation in Vietnam of young drug users who are learning about issues of HIV, issues about keeping good health. Now, they will not often learn from somebody else, like maybe a medical doctor at the beginning, because maybe the language that is used will not be understood. We start talking medical terms to some of these young people, they will not understand what you are talking about. So it is important, when you think about peers, it is really talking from one person who is from our background, with our level of education, with our level of understanding, and then we talk to these other people who are like us. So in this situation, they are all in a circle, they are all from similar backgrounds, similar age groups, similar education levels. In these circumstances, it's also male. Maybe it is an issue that if a female was here, she would feel uncomfortable. As even though she is maybe a drug user, she may not actually be comfortable in this group. We do not know. But this is what I'm talking about for this session, is about how do we use peer education to get information, education, and the communication to understand the seriousness of what is taking place regarding drug use and what you could call health risks, bloodborne viruses, but also issues like tuberculosis, gangrene, abscess, diarrhea, all these things. They need to get information from their peers. Okay, so in a I'm not going to spend too much time on this session because I want to also do an activity with you, or you are going to be doing the activity, and I think we've heard from the evaluations, it's a nice way of interaction. So I'm just going to give you some basic concepts because you have the paper in front of you, but to just get it clear in your mind. So really there is actually nothing sophisticated in the word peer education. It's really just this sharing of information. And in many ways, it's just me communicating with you. That's sort of it. It's a form of communication. It's a verbal communication. We're on the same level and you understand, hopefully you understand me, and I understand you when we are speaking the same language. So it's also a peer. It's an equal. Someone who is on the same level. Now, it's a very interesting thing when we start talking about law enforcement and health issues. Yes, a law enforcement person may listen to me, may listen to a professor of medicine, but the reality is they would probably listen even more closely if it was a policeman speaking about the issues of harm reduction, because they are from the same group. Who is this doctor telling me what I should be doing with law enforcement? I'm a law enforcement man. Yes, he is a very nice man or a nice woman. Yes, he is educated, she is educated. Yes, she is caring, but I am a law enforcement man. So, what do? We bring on policemen who have been educated in the issues of harm reduction, and we use the police to speak to police. Much more effective, or we can use a combination. We have the police, but we also have the doctor together. They work together, they have become friends. A good friend of mine in Calcutta is the police commissioner of Calcutta, and he is very informed now of drug issues and harm reduction. And while during the day he is working as the police commissioner of Calcutta, on the weekends he is also the president of a needle syringe program, because he understands HIV and harm reduction and drug issues. And drug use is one of those chronic relapsing conditions. You do not wake up in the morning saying, I want to be a drug user, I want to be drug dependent. People do not do that. So he has this understanding, even though he is a policeman, he has an understanding that these people are often victims of dependency. They would not want to. You may have spoken to some people at RSKO at the methadone. They would like to get off the drugs. It's not what they don't want to continue using drugs. They would like to get off drugs, but it is not that simple to get off drugs. So, this getting back to peer education is about trying to communicate to people from the same background, same way of thinking, the same ideas. And when that occurs, then the messages are much stronger. I hope that's all clear. So as we're saying here, peer education is in different contexts. So in some situations, like in here, we have a whole group of drug users who are learning about overdose. They can talk in a language. They may get the support of a doctor and a nurse, but the good thing is to actually communicate with a whole group of people like it. This is basically a form of a peer education. We are all educated. We have all got an understanding of the different terms, and we are quite prepared to be open and listen to other people and learn from other people. So this is a form of a peer education. We are quite prepared to learn from our colleagues here. So this is just a series of different, like whether it is going to be in a classroom, it's like young teenagers. They are all peers. They are listening, what is the music today? What is the fashion today? What are the foods that people eat? This is all, we listen to our peers. They inform us what is done correct, what is not, what is out of fashion, what is in fashion, all of this, and it's like information. And people communicate to other people. So as I've said, where can it be done? Now of course it can be done in a classroom, example like here, and we have sort of like a room, like a drop-in centre. For people who went to Stigma today, you saw that there was a very large hall, an area that people could sit around on the ground and, exactly like this, learn from each other. Very informal. Doesn't have to be a big office, just a room. And here, of course, this is actually in Burma, where people have been using, this is like a table, and people are just learning about the different types of drugs, about the way drugs are taken, about the risks of sharing needles. This is where they are talking in their environment. Sometimes they are not going to come into this room. They don't even, maybe they do not know about this room, but they know that there is an area where they all talk about drugs and how to take drugs, hopefully safely. So we think about, okay, well, what is it? Why do we use the peers? And what is required to be a successful peer educator or a worker? Okay. Now, within the world of drug users, if we sort of look upon it as that, for them, it's often about education of users, for users, about the user, by the user. This is in a very strict sense. I mean, I of course can also go in, even though maybe I am not a drug user, but I can contribute to the conversation by informing them that these are ways that you can protect yourself from HIV or hepatitis C. So, but in generally strict terms, peer education is amongst the same group of people with the same background. Now, as it was mentioned yesterday, I think, it's a very old sort of way of communicating, and it has been used for many different groups in society for many, many years. Now, for people who say the men who have sex with other men, now for many of those people, that is an activity that can place them on the margins of the community. And the way that they can get information from other people and from traditional sources of a doctor, often they will not want to go to the doctor and say, I am having a sex with another man, this is a big serious issue, it may be a crime, etc. So they feel very uncomfortable about going to a conventional health service. So where do they learn their information? They learn their information from their peers. They learn from other people who are also having sex with other men. And this can happen with sex workers. The sex workers often experience very severe discrimination and stigma. They cannot go into a local hospital and say, I am a sex worker, I have some health problems, but I do not know what to do. Often they will feel very intimidated and very, because sex worker is also an illegal activity, they will not be comfortable about just talking to any doctor. They often have to talk to their other sex workers to get information about if they have a discharge, if they may be pregnant. They are scared to talk to other, sort of what you would say, conventional medical services. So they go to their peers. Now, I think I've already mentioned most of this here, so I'll go on. And I think generally what we're talking within the drug using circle is there is a very high level of distrust. And the main reason for that is because of the criminal behavior. It is viewed as a crime. If I say that I'm a drug user, and people have sometimes said this, they can actually be put away into prison. Maybe for 5 years, maybe for 10 years. Maybe they are forgotten. They are moved away because they were honest and they said, I'm a drug user, I have a health problem, but then someone picked up the phone and said, I have a drug user here, the police come, and then they are taken away. This happens. I think people can believe that this would actually happen in reality. It's not a fantasy. So because of that, they are very scared to come out and say, I am needing help. Then of course, there is this whole thing about, with drug users, there is like a subculture. What is happening in Atma Jaya with the students is one thing. What is happening with some students in Atma Jaya who may be using drugs is like another subculture. They have a secret language sometimes. They start talking in terms and of ways that other students do not understand. It's like you create another language. Now, if you're with the peers, you understand the language. Sometimes because there is a lot of slang, a lot of different words that are used that you and I will not understand, but it is a code. It can be used a secret code and a secret ritual, and you are not really part of that because you're not a drug user. So that type of information is never getting through. The health information doesn't get through to them because they want to remain hidden. And I think we discovered this today with one of the participants where one of the outreach worker mentioned about that in their area that there's a lot of drug use. This was in your area, and this man lives here, he lives in that area, and didn't know that there was so much drug use taking place. But it was a revelation that maybe you knew that there was some drug use, but not the amount of drug use. And the reality is it goes hidden. It's hidden away because they do not want to be identified. Now, often what takes place with peer education is that drug users also have a lot of information and they have a lot of expertise about certain things that they cannot actually explain to other people, because if they find out or someone finds out about what they are doing, once again the penalty will occur. But there is a lot of expertise amongst people who use drugs, like where do I inject correctly? Which vein should I be using? What should I be aware of if I have a particular disease? A lot of this information is kept within the drug user community, and it's important with the language that they use, that this language that they use can be used for others to understand what are the problems taking place. And I think regarding why we're using this thing about the peer education, a lot of it is because there is a lot of interaction between the drug users. They are often, like all of us, we are communicating on a regular basis. What is the latest that's happening? Maybe it could be something like, what is the latest drug that is available? We have just heard about a new drug. And we will not often know about this for a little bit later down. Maybe the organisation like Stigma will know about it because they have their staff, they have their outreach workers going out onto the street within the Asian context, there is frequently no other way of getting information except from your other drug users. Many drug users, as you have discovered, have no access to any services. They say around 5 to 10% maximum of drug users have any sort of connection with a service. So what has happened to 90 to 95% of other drug users? Where are they getting their information? They're not getting it from Stigma, they're not getting it from any of the other services, because most people do not go to Stigma. The only way they can get their information is from their friends. That's their main source of information, not the services. So this is where we get quite dependent on peer education, because the peers speak to their other friends and tell them about issues like, have you heard that there is a new disease here? No, what is this disease? I heard just recently from my other friend, hepatitis C. And I've heard that hepatitis C spreads much quickly than HIV. And then they say, how is this? Oh, with hepatitis C, you can even get it from the water that we mix the drug with. And even in the spoon, if there is a little bit of blood in the spoon, and you touch that with a cut on your finger, you can also get hepatitis C. HIV, no, but with hepatitis C, it is very easy to be transmitted. And this is where this information starts spreading amongst their friends, because they are talking about it. They are using drugs, but do they wish to be unwell? No. No one wants to be unwell. People will want to be using their drugs, but they don't want to be sick from using their drugs. And this is where they listen to other friends and say, oh, this is what I should be doing. Or, the other thing, drug overdose. They start talking amongst their friends and say, I have just heard there is a drug that has come here, and if you inject it too much, you can die. Oh, I did not know this. I'm very scared about this. Oh, well, you should really just take a little bit at the beginning, and if you are still fine and there is no problems with your breathing, then you can take a bit more. But if you take it all at once, as you have been in the past, the chances are you will have an overdose, you will stop breathing, and you will die. Now that type of information can often only be said from one friend to another friend, because sometimes the services are not aware that there is a drug that is very strong. This tends to happen. It can take a while for a service to be aware that there is a drug on the market that can kill people. But amongst their friends, they tell their friends straight away because they are wanting to protect their friends. That is what a friend is for. A friend is also to protect them. If you hear about something, you want to protect them. We do this with all of our friends. Do not take this medicine. This medicine will make you very itchy. This medicine may come out with, you might get severe headaches. We will tell our friends about something if we think it is going to cause harm. Drug users do exactly the same thing. They will tell their friends when something may be causing harm. And this piece of information is often the only information source is from their friends, not from a hospital, not from a doctor, not from a nurse. They have to listen to their friends. Hopefully that is clear? Yeah? Actually, I'm not really going to go into this behavioural theory and peer education. I'll miss this section because I really want to do this activity, but you have got some notes there. And if we need to explain this a bit more, I can come back. But I'll move on. Okay, now, the characteristics and the advantages of using peers, okay? Now, the reality is, with a drug user and amongst their peers, they are an insider. They are in that group, they know what is happening. And because of that, they also have access to their other friends. So they're an insider, they use drugs, they know that their friends are using drugs, and so they can pass on a lot of the information. They also have shared experiences. They've all gone through the same thing. They know after a month or a week or 2 years or 5 years, they have a whole group of similar experiences. Most drug users have experienced an overdose, particularly when the heroin has been quite strong, or they have mixed it in with another drug like diazepam. Or they started drinking whiskey and then they had some cannabis and then they started injecting heroin. And so all of these sort of drugs becomes a major problem. So I think this is one when you think about shared experiences. And because they've had a shared experience, they are very sensitive to other people's needs. Because we're talking about the continuation of a friendship. As I've mentioned, there is a very good personal knowledge about drugs amongst drug users. Drug users may not know what the economy is like. They may not know which football team won. They may not know a lot of other different things, but they will frequently know about the different types of drugs and the drugs that can have a good effect and get you what you could call a high. This sort of nice sensational. And the advantage of knowing that sort of information is they can develop what you could call a good relationship, and they also are credible. They will know when you start speaking to a drug user, they will often know whether you're a credible person with your own insights about a drug. They will pick up fairly quickly that you are actually not that truthful, or you do not actually have very good insights. And because of a peer, from one drug user to another, there is that credibility. I think it's also important about this issue about speaking the same language. It's very important that when a drug user speaks to another drug user, they are using the same terms. Now, a doctor speaking to a drug user in a conventional hospital environment, that is often not the same language, but that's sort of a medical language. Now, the person who is maybe on the street and they are 16 years of age, and there is a doctor who is 45 years of age, the language barriers can be enormous, but not amongst their peers, because they are all talking the same, and because of that, they have an ability to communicate honest, truthful, factual information. Now, the main problems about the peer educators involving having peer educators as part of a program. These are not always found in all the programs, but they are something to be considered. For some people, having a peer educator as part of a harm reduction program is the issue about keeping their own drug use under control. Some of these people could still be using, but they are part of the program. And then there is this very big difficulty of, yes, I am a peer, which means I may still be using drugs, but I'm also a professional. I'm also a professional person within the service. How do I keep that balance? And that becomes difficult for some people. Not for all people. Some people can say, when I am at work, I am going to have no drugs in my system, or if I have drugs in my system, it is not going to affect my work performance. My work performance becomes number one. And then maybe at the end of the day, then I'm going to start using drugs. But during the day, when I'm at work and I'm on the street, I'm not going to be using drugs. But for some people, that can be difficult to sort of split between the two, between the professional and also still remaining a peer. And a peer is, I'm still using the drugs. That can be quite demanding for some people. Then, of course, for peers is the demanding nature of what you could call their clients, the people that they are mixing with. Now, of course, an outreach worker can also be a peer educator. You can still have an outreach worker, which in many countries and in many organizations, they have outreach workers who are also peers. They can still be using, but they are very functional. And because they are functional, because they have a very good insight as to what is taking place, and it could be a female drug user who is still using, but she is also very much inside with other females. I may or may not be able to get into the female world because the females, as we have discussed, have a lot of stigma and discrimination. And this will be explored tomorrow when we have a session about female drug users. And of course there is an issue about the lack of supervision. When you go out onto the street and you are a peer educator and you may be linked in with an organisation called Stigma, people are thinking, I wonder what they are doing. I haven't seen them for 4 hours. I hope they're doing their work. And with that supervision, and just they are doing something, but it's sometimes difficult to assess what is it that they're actually doing. And they are, of course, informally telling people about health education. You have to sort of view this, in many ways, it's about the promotion of public health. They are promoting the way of preserving health, the way of protecting themselves from various injuries, various diseases, but it's done in a very informal way, but it can still be incredibly productive and very appropriate for this sector of the community who are not comfortable about coming to a doctor in a hospital. Because as we already heard, sometimes when they go to a hospital, they are rejected because they're a drug user, because of the stigma and discrimination. And because they are sometimes even thrown out of a hospital, that gives you an idea as to how much hatred and intolerance there can be. And the only people that they can get comfortable with is amongst their friends, their peers. Now, of course, what's basically, I'm just going to go through a couple of these, is the issue of the services. What sort of problems can happen for the service? What we're sort of talking about here is services can think that having peer educators as part of their organisation, there can be a lack of professionalism. That sometimes services want professionalism, and I think that's a very good aim and it's a good goal to sort of have professionalism. But some services find it difficult to have a group of people inside a community health centre who may not be wearing a suit and a tie, may have just casual clothing, may sort of be walking all over the place, and they think, now what is this about? This is part of our staff? How can we have these as part of our staff? So this is how people start thinking, where you have to start thinking out of the conventional role. I think in harm reduction we have to be very innovative, we have to be creative, and we also have to be very open-minded, because frequently there is a very good learning experience from having a whole group of people working in a service for the same goal. And the same goal at this point in time is trying to preserve the life of the drug users and also trying to preserve the life of others who may end up getting HIV. As we've seen, the wives who become HIV infected are never using any drugs, the children who become HIV infected because the mother has become infected, all of these people have the potential of becoming infected. And it all really came about through some drug user, for whatever reason, was using a shared needle and became infected. So, and for some people within the service who are peer educators, is because they are considered sometimes as not very important within the service itself. And because they're not considered as important, they start to lack motivation. They don't feel like they're really a part of the service. And I think it's important to remember, from my insights when it comes to outreach peer educators, and they may still be using, is the fact that for me, many of those people are heroes. They are the people who are working out in the hot weather, out in the monsoons, out working on the streets, while the service people are all sitting around in their air-conditioned environment and typing away on computers, and the outreach worker who may be also a peer and still using, they are out there every single day in the heat. And they're never considered as really being as part of the service or as part of some sort of equality. They're frequently put down at the lower level, and because they are put down at the lower level, their self-esteem, and they don't feel like they're part of owning. They're not really part of a service. They feel like they are on the outskirts of the service, even though the service are becoming quite dependent. If you are going to set up a service, you cannot just rely on the doctors and the nurses and whoever within the service. You're going to actually think about having the outreach programs, and some of these outreach people are also going to be peers, which means they're potentially also going to be users of drugs. And I think it's very important for service providers to be aware that if a peer is going to be using any drugs, as long as they're being done in a responsible way and it is actually not going to interfere with the way that they operate out on the streets. And this, for some people, can be very difficult to comprehend, that we can allow these people who are still drug users, but they are still actually maybe potentially also receiving some money for their work as well. And there are ways of working this out, about giving some money, and it may be on a daily basis. Some services have peer educators, they are employed by the service, they don't get a weekly wage, they may be employed for a period of 2 to 4 hours. This is going to be their role. They're educated about what they need to get out information to drug users, and at the end of that period of time, the 2 hours or the 4 hours, they will receive that money for that. So they're not like getting a weekly wage, they're getting a daily wage for their contribution, and that is a way of making them still feeling a part of the actual program. And I think it's also important that with peer educators who still may be going out, that they get a lot of support by the services. Because I think they need to feel like they are a part of the service, and to be part of a service, there is a lot of need to assist them as they are going out onto the streets on a regular basis. And I think there is one part of this professionalism, that with a peer educator, if they are with a particular service, that they are not going out there in what you would say is a drug state. Because if they're going out there in a drug state, supposed to be doing education, there can be a barrier between them and drug users. The drug users, although they may all be drug users, the peer educator is also in a different professional hat during the day or when they are on duty. They are not supposed to be going out doing their work in a drug-stated mind. That's a very important thing, because the drug users themselves will feel a sense of, not betrayal, but they'll think they may even be wanting drugs, the drug user. And here is a peer educator who's already taken their drugs and is very unstable, and there's a level of distrust and a level of probably agitation between the drug user and the peer educator who may be drugged. They've taken some drugs before they went out to work. And I think it's important with peer education that they need to know their limitations as a peer educator. It's very important to be aware you cannot do everything. It's like a doctor or a nurse. It is not humanly possible to do everything. You cannot be knowledgeable in everything. You may be very, very, very good in neurology, or you may be very good in orthopedics, or you may be very good in pediatrics, looking after children, but you cannot be skilled in everything. It's very difficult to be skilled in everything. And a peer educator needs to also be informed about their limitations as to what they can do, what they can offer to people. And I think because of that, if they're aware of their limitations as to what they can do, then there's a lot more successful cases, a lot more successful outcomes. And I think what generally tends to happen is that a peer educator can have a certain amount of information, and once they cannot answer or provide a solution to a particular problem, they, as a general rule, we then encourage them to come to the service. So it's like, I cannot fix your broken leg. It is impossible. I am not a doctor. But I can see that you are limping. You have a problem here. But what we can do is bring you into the service. And once they are into the service, then a referral can occur to have an x-ray. And then we can arrange. But a peer educator cannot do everything. They can hand out information. They can also be handing out even the needles. They can be handing out, yes, we know that there is a doctor who is a very friendly doctor, and this doctor is open every Friday from 10 o'clock until 12 o'clock each day, and he understands drug users. Peer educators can have that type of information, but they really need to know their limitations as to what, or they're going to have many, many problems that will start coming up. And I think it's also important regarding this whole support, and this happens with all staff, is the fact of burnout, exhausted. They are working so hard. You can sometimes get maybe a drug user who is HIV positive, and they feel, I have to help my friends. I have to inform them about how to protect themselves from HIV. So what do? They work and work and work 7 days a week. 16 hours a day. They are so guilty about what has happened. They do not want they do not want their friends to be infected. So they are working so hard that they will have a physical breakdown and a mental breakdown. This can happen to many people who have become infected, or they've got hepatitis C. Whatever it is, you get many people, if they do not have this balance, then they're actually going to not function as well. At the beginning, they'll function very well. But as time goes on, they will not function well. And they will start getting angry towards other people. Or they are not sleeping. And then, of course, they will actually start becoming physically ill. And I think you will notice this, and you will probably notice this increasingly. More people who become HIV infected, which is what's going to happen, because they're going to start becoming ill, they will really feel a sense of obligation. They want to help others, not to become I am infected. They want to make sure nobody else is infected. So they work, 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 and then they collapse. This is something that is a big issue that you, as a service provider, you need to be very much aware of these issues. And I think they also need to, as a peer educator, they need to learn how to say no. Many people just want to say yes to everything, but it is not possible to say yes to everything. They have to, once again, this is part of the limitations, because they do not have all the skills. some of these people may have had minimal schooling, or they've had good schooling, it doesn't really matter, but they're not going to actually be aware of every single thing, like a sexual transmitted infection. They may know a little bit that there is a bit of a pus, and something is not going right, but they cannot know which antibiotics to take. It's impossible. That's something for the doctor. And so they need to be aware of some very simple sort of health issues, and then they refer them back to stigma, back to a doctor who is understanding, back to a nurse, somebody, but they need to know when to say no. That's important, or they'll have further problems. And this is, of course, this whole issue about referrals. It's like all of us. Doctors do this all the time. They cannot know everything, so they refer to another doctor. Someone has got a problem with their chest. I'm not a chest specialist. I just deal in limbs. So you referred somebody to, and this is what peer educators can do, as well as the outreach worker. And this is just an example of some materials. I think tomorrow Stigma are going to be bringing a lot of IEC materials, information, education, communication materials. I've actually asked Wulan, the person who some people have met, she is going to bring some information that is handed out to drug users, so they can have information about what to be aware of when maybe a potential overdose, what will happen with an overdose, also about how to inject safer, that you shouldn't be injecting in the neck. You get many people who inject in this here, and that's very, very dangerous. Or they start injecting in the groin. This is also very dangerous because you can hit an artery. And if you hit an artery, you can actually die, hemorrhage, and you'll become also infection in this area. So there are information that is handed out, and this type of information can also be from their peers to their other peers, friends to friends. Do not inject here, do not inject here. All these things, they need to be aware, and they will listen to their friends, because maybe they saw their friend die. They had a drug, they had a party, and then they woke up in the morning and they looked, and the person next to them in the chair is dead. Now they're very concerned about this, and they understood that the reason was this particular drug was too strong for this, because the person had been drinking half a bottle of whiskey, and then they injected heroin, and so they died. Now those people do not want this to happen to their friends, so they will tell their friends, if you're going to drink, you drink small amounts. If you are going to mix it with heroin, like we mentioned before, polydrug use. Polydrug use is the mixing of various drugs, and this is becoming an increasing problem all around the world. And polydrug use, when it is not controlled, will lead to drug overdose. And the way this information is exchanged from one friend to another, not to mix your drugs. And if you are going to mix them, you take a smaller amount of drugs, not half a bottle of whiskey, and then inject heroin. This will definitely, more than likely, end up in a drug result. In a drug overdose. So what we're going to do now, any questions before we do the activity? This is always an opportunity to ask questions, and I would encourage people to ask questions. This is an opportunity before we do an activity. Is peer education clear? It's something that is quite common in school, student groups, in music groups, in fashion, as I mentioned, with the sex worker, people who cannot access information from anybody because the activity is illegal, and drug user is illegal. And as I said, not everybody can access accurate information. They just hear about myths, not accurate facts. Any question? Or it is clear? Yes? Yes. Okay. So the question is, she's had an issue similar to this, is how do you select the appropriate people to become a peer educator? That's certainly something to think about, because this is going to become an issue as more programs start to expand all around the country. And if we can see the value of peer educators, how do we know we are getting the right people? Any suggestions? What would you do? How would you select having someone as a peer educator as being part of your service? It's something everybody has to think about. I can actually put it back to you and say, how did you select? How did you know? What? You failed. Okay. So what was happening here is they would select someone, but they would remain for a very short time. And there was a turnover. One after the next, after the next, after the next. And the commitment was very low. Now, how do we address this? This is something that we do like through what they would call trial and error. We would obviously, at the beginning, try to ensure that the peer educator knew exactly what their role was going to be, what was expected of them, what was realistically expected of them, and also trying to ensure the expectations of the service was not too high. Maybe as someone was getting a little bit longer in the service, we would start gradually increasing their responsibilities. But maybe at the beginning, when they first come, the responsibilities are just small. And then there is an assessment about how they are progressing. What sort of issues? Why do you want to become a peer educator? Because there is an issue about just because you are a drug user does not mean that you are a good peer educator. That's a myth. Just because you use drugs means that you can actually then communicate to other drug users. That doesn't add up, because it's not a reality. There are certain traits that people need to have before they become a peer educator, that they have an ability to communicate, and that they are actually part of that group. Now, you can have an older drug user who will come. Now, the problem is, if the older drug user cannot relate to the younger drug users, because all the younger drug users are using ecstasy, but the older drug user is just using heroin and has no understanding about that group take all the disco dancing, and the other older person is using a different drug altogether. Now that can be a major problem, because this older peer educator will not understand young people. I mean, there are going to be many, many examples where it's like an interviewing. You are interviewing people and you ask them regarding what is it, why is it that you would wish to become involved, and you are also then being aware of the limitations about just because using drugs does not mean that you are going to be the appropriate person. Jimmy, do you want to add anything about having... Yeah. Yeah, okay. This exercise that we are going to do, this will explore this a little bit more. Yes. Any other question? Yes?
I think for doing the activities, we have to make sure the time, what time we will finish the activity.
The activities, yes, the activity will be, say, 15 minutes.
Okay.
We're finishing at 5.
Okay.
Yes.
Just to make sure that everybody knows that we are not going
No, no,
to
no,
be
no,
longer
no,
like
we are-
yesterday,
no.
because people...
Yeah.
biar maksudnya bagus. Terus dirinya gini.
Aja cuma orang belakang.
Oh iya ya salah. Sebenarnya sih intinya di situ dok. Jadi karena mereka masih self centered, masih mikirin obat, jadi mereka konsentrasinya kurang, tanggung jawabnya kurang, terus rasa care sama orang lainnya juga dipertanyakan. Bagaimana mereka memikirkan orang lain kalau yang mereka pikirkan hanya bagaimana diri mereka terpuaskan dari segi obatnya.
Support walaupun kita nggak setuju, kita sekarang kelompok support dari kita.
Saya mendukung mereka kami apa mereka merasa digunakan. Apa menimbulkan self esteemnya bahwa lu bukan orang nggak berguna tapi bisa kalau
Karena research yang kalau nggak karena orang akan menilai bahwa pelayanan itu kan nggak bisa dipercaya tanggung jawab karena
Lagi dia juga rentan terhadap aspirasi kalau dia ini tadi
bisa dibedain nggak antara yang publik sama yang private?
ya dua-duanya ngerangkap lah
Maksudnya dalam pengertian kalau publik itu lebih gampang untuk estetis, kalau misalnya private itu
Iya.
is fine, but you still need to do this important, keep this for tomorrow. Constitution and all the issues about assessments. It was the first session today. Number 2 was the site visits. You all went to a site. So I want to find out, was that a good thing, useful, not useful, whatever. Number 3, you all came back here and we had an open discussion about what you learned from the site so that you could hear from your other friends. We want to find out, was that useful to have an open discussion which was all in Bahasa. Then we had a small session of the Indian film. It wasn't complete, but we just want to get an idea. Did you find that useful to get some insights about what was happening in India? And then I finished it with peer education, which is really just the theory. The activity, of course, is still ongoing. It will be finished tomorrow. But this is not about the activity, it's about the theory of peer education. Was that useful for you? And so on.